Today's guest is Ben Dutter, the Chief Strategy Officer at Power Digital, one of the best independent agencies out there. Ben has worked with brands and agencies throughout his career and also led a turnaround at Power Digital itself. Here are three things that I learned from Ben in this conversation: how he led Power Digital's transformation after his arrival, whether there's any truth to the Sam Altman quote that 95% of marketing tasks are going to be done by AI, and the importance of creativity in modern marketing. So let's get into it. Well, Ben, thank you for joining us on The Marketing Scientist. This is going to be a really fun conversation. I've been looking forward to it for a long time. Okay, so Ben, there was this recent quote from Sam Altman about how 95% of everything that marketers do, creative strategists, is going to be done through AI. Now, obviously, there's a lot of hype in AI, but I'm curious to get your take as somebody who's been on the agency side and thinking about this strategically. What's your take? Is that hype or is there reality to it?
Yeah, it's a good question, and it's Sam's job is to make those kinds of statements, right? It's like man with vested interest in topic claims topic will be successful, right? That's the cynic in me. In reality, though, I think what he says is maybe not 100% accurate, but directionally accurate. I do think that the vast majority of what marketing is today, especially performance marketing and data-driven marketing, can be automated. Even without AI, I think a lot of it can be automated today, and a lot of it is automated today. It's something like more than 50% of all spend running through Meta and Google are already optimized algorithmically and programmatically, which you could argue is a form of machine learning and a form of AI, right? And so it's sort of, where do you draw the line as these things evolve? I think the area of opportunity that's most interesting is on the creative side, and with the emergence of generative AI. And I think obviously with Sora and some of the things that OpenAI has created, there's a lot of opportunity there. On the agency side, I've already seen AI adoption from brands and from our internal services has skyrocketed the last several years. Even before OpenAI was releasing, there's a lot of to be explored with iterative testing, especially into things like text-based knowledge. But now we're starting to get into actual image recognition testing and generative AI creation of new creatives and ad units and things like that. And you're starting to see that everywhere now. So I do think it's somewhat inevitable. However, even with a lot of those, there is such a thing as brand sensitivity. Humans are still very involved. Clients still want approval on things. There are certain regulatory pressures depending on the country that you're in, as well as the channel that you're in and the audience that you're targeting. There's restrictions, for example, against minors or against people with health conditions. So you have to, right now at least, keep a very tight, short leash. And I think that it will only become more and more important in the future as Gen AI becomes a common part of our workflows.
Yeah, it's a very good point, right? The stat that you threw out there, that over 50% of spend on Meta and Google is already going through some sort of an AI slash ML based sort of algorithm rather than just sort of human, manual sort of optimizations and bidding. Most people, I think, don't recognize that's already been happening for the last like 5, 6 years. It's not a new phenomenon. Um, on the Gen AI side of the house, how does, I recently saw a news article, I think it was yesterday or today, that WPP has now partnered with Google on using Gemini for a whole bunch of, creative production internally. Are you all doing the same thing at Power Digital? Are you all sort of building stuff in-house? Like, how do you think about the creative side of the house and how much of the creative work you're offloading to AI workflows versus still having the human involvement?
Can't give away all my secrets, Pranav. I gotta keep some close to the chest. No, in seriousness, yeah, we're exploring everything, right? I think that what we've been focused on is definitely on the text-based side, right? In the content and ad copy, um, article writing, blog writing, things like that, search generative experiences, and how to kind of get the best use out of that. All of those things are definite work streams, right? As far as, hey, we're gonna throw in a brand guideline into a Gen AI tool and have it spit out 30,000 ads, I'm less bullish on that yet. I haven't seen the quality or the impact of such testing worth it. There's been some interesting publications recently in Forrester, in particular, the work of Nikhil Lai, who has talked about how quantity is not quality, and that
Mm,
creative is still such an important and huge lever to pull. It's arguably the majority of the impact in marketing is driven by the creative and the creative strategy, and so having really strong data backed ideas as well as some of that kind of human ingenuity is important. Now, where I do see in the short term, and I'm talking the next 12 to 24 months, a lot of things to change is around the production and post production. Today, you might have a team doing a shoot for a TV commercial, 20, 30 people, and maybe a year from now, you completely Gen AI 90% of that, and then you have a team of two or three editors and maybe a creative director, right? So it used to be 12 people, 20 people, maybe it's two or three people. And so that accelerates the speed that they are able to produce those assets, as well as it allows them to easily make iterations and things. So, but as we see, there's recent regulatory pressure. There was a bill released this week that's up for
mm,
consideration in the U.S. I think it's in the House around how any kind of large language model has to disclose its source data. And that's a big
mm.
topic of contention right now. And so I think what we're going to see is a shift towards more small custom models where brands or agencies build their own Gen AI
Right.
knowledge graph and language models and image models off of verified legal kind of white labeled imagery rather than scraping the internet, which is what a lot of the alleged kind of knowledge
Yeah.
graphs have been built on today.
Yeah. No, that's a really interesting point. And so I heard another piece of legislation which blew my mind that there's this idea that any piece of targeted advertising needs to be consented in by the end consumer before it can even be displayed. And I was like, how is this enforceable? I don't know if you've heard anything about that. I thought it was a pretty, honestly, like not a great idea, things are changing quite fast in both the Gen AI, but also in the privacy landscape. And I'm curious how, what your take is on, is everything going to move to that world where there's no sense of, targeting at an individual at a user level going forward?
Yeah, I think that it's interesting. I think that a lot of those legislations are sort of, for lack of a better term, to call attention, or stunt or something like that, right? And I think that though it's valid to bring up. Now, I think a lot of it will come into the nuance of not just the enforcement, but the definitions. The language and the specificity of the mechanics are important. For example, how do you determine something is targeted? What
Yeah.
is that, a cohort of people? How big is the cohort? Is it one person? Is it 10 people? Is it 100 people? What's kind of the minimum allowable cohort? Is that going to be enshrined in law? Is there going to be a constitutional right to privacy? I think that's something that's gaining some steam, right? And that's interesting.
Interesting.
What I've always told brands and marketers alike is that if you have any system that requires you to invade somebody's information non-consensually, then you are taking advantage of the technology and you're probably overperforming of what you deserve. And so I would rather build brands and build marketing systems and build measurement systems and optimization systems that don't require that kind of unethical practice or that kind of level of invasion of privacy. And frankly, in my experience, it's not necessary. I think outside of a couple of very niche industries that have extremely long sales cycles, like business to business, and you're really trying to land some huge landmark multi-million dollar deal and you want to track every single business transaction that target audience is doing, maybe that's justified to some extent. I think sort of all's fair in B2B, but from an individual consumer level, you don't need it. I don't think it's actually that beneficial, and I think it actually just makes people react negatively overall. So whether or not it gets enshrined in law or is enforced, I think there's just a general push towards making systems that are not dependent upon these kind of technologies that make people uncomfortable and frankly aren't ethical.
So that's a great point. You actually have this statement in your LinkedIn profile that one of your jobs is to maintain a high ethical standard. What made you say that in your LinkedIn profile? Like, why do you think that is even a statement that needs to be made?
Yeah, I think that, ethics is an important component in my life personally. I think that I want to be proud of the work that I've done. I want to be proud of the impact that I've made on individuals and on, society at large. I want to be a good citizen of the kind of global stage. And so for me, it's important to treat that personally. It's very for my own center of morals. It's important. Why I say that in my job description and why I think that's important at Power Digital or any marketing agency or any service provider is that it's very easy and natural for capitalistic based service based businesses to start to move and make these small concessions, right? And that's kind of where the
Mm,
erosion of an ethical standard happens is, well, we're going to help this client or this business that we don't really agree with philosophically, but they're going to pay us a lot of money, so we're going to do it. Or as an individual, I know it's not really the right thing to do to increase my client's ad spend in this case, but I'm compensated off of ad spend, so I'm going to do it anyway because I have mouths to feed and my personal priorities take precedent over what my client wants. And so I'm not saying those are real examples. I'm just giving, a story here. But the point being that
makes sense.
having these kind of strict guardrails of these are certain things we will never do. We will never lie to a client. We will never lie to an employee. We will never do something that's only in the benefit of the company and not in the benefit of our client or our employee, right? Some of these sort of principles that we have are really important. And I think that from a marketing perspective and a brand perspective, it's also important because we've established ourselves as a highly transparent, ethical marketing partner where we want to do things that everybody is comfortable with and everybody can win. And I do genuinely believe that that's possible, even in kind of the march towards maximizing profits at all costs in capitalism.
I love that answer, Ben. That's why I like you. That's awesome. So tell me about how did this role of a chief strategy officer even come about at Power Digital? Was that always part of the equation, or what was the need that you were trying to solve as an agency that this strategy role came about? Because I know that that's not how you started. So tell us about the evolution there.
Yeah, for sure. So, at a high level, no, it wasn't always part of the playbook or part of the org structure. When I started out, I was hired to help us identify common trends of why clients were not satisfied with our services. This was a few years ago now, and I think it's a reasonable thing to try to hire somebody for. You're a service based business. You want your service to be successful and effective. It's kind of mutually beneficial, right? The client is satisfied
Yeah.
with the service that you're providing, the product that you're developing, and you're satisfied from a business perspective because you're retaining your client and they're paying you a fee. And so that was my job to come in and assess that. And one of the first things that I found, uh, and it was no fault of the team or no fault of any of the individuals there, but many of the clients were dissatisfied at the time with our strategic capabilities. They were like, "You guys do awesome work tactically. You're the best in the business at delivering kind of ad results, at delivering creative rapidly, at all the kind of performance marketing things, doing SEO. You guys do tons and tons of awesome SEO work in terms of technical SEO and writing articles and all those things. But there was no real centralized organization or process around how does this connect overall to the business outcome. And so we were seen as kind of an amalgamation of a bunch of point solutions. And in fact, that was how the company was structured is every channel, every marketing solution was its own department. They had their own head of the department. They were measured in that way and they were treated as sort of individual businesses. And when I came in and was talking with a lot of clients that were decided to leave the company or who had historically left and were reviewing kind of exit surveys and NPS surveys and things like that, the common theme there was, we don't feel that you have a cohesive strategy. We don't feel like we have a peer of someone who we can talk
Mm.
to from the client's perspective, a CMO or CEO, and who is managing on your side. And that wasn't universal, but that was a common trend. And so I ideated the first kind of concepts of a team of people who were responsible for that very thing. Their job is to come up with a plan, come up with a strategy across audience, product, market, and then the actual go to market motion for our clients, as well as how do we measure that, collect that information, and create a closed feedback loop where we said, okay, we have this plan, we have this hypothesis, we're going to do this thing, we're going to run this experiment. Did that actually generate the intended outcome? Why or why not? Let's try it again and keep going. And over the years, that became the strategy division, which we have kind of two wings. We have our solutions org, which is all what you would consider as traditional strategy agency, um, market research, media planning, you name it. And then we have our data intelligence arm, which is all around measurement, data collection, marketing science, media mix modeling, incrementality testing, so on and so forth. And so those two teams working together under kind of my initial ideation and leadership really grew that out into a strong unit. And now, and we know this because we're private equity backed and our backers work with other service providers like us, we know that now our churn is exemplary, our retention rates are exemplary in the market, and we never hear from clients anymore, hey, you guys aren't strategic enough. That's not really an issue. So over the years, that role has improved in visibility and in importance. And now, we take strategy to mean a lot of different things, but I oversee that division, but also help and am a stakeholder in company strategy overall in a number of facets.
That's a wonderful story, and such a good example of, you know, taking an analytical view of the problem that was presented to you, right? Like looking at the NPS results, the exit surveys, and so on and so forth, and really attacking that with full force. That's awesome. Um, you touched on measurement at the end, and anybody listening to this or anybody who's familiar with your profile probably has seen a post from you about incrementality or marketing mix modeling or incrementality testing. And one of the things that I like about you, you said something like, if you're doing 1 million or 10 million in marketing spend, you probably don't need marketing mix modeling. You don't probably need a whole bunch of sophisticated measurement. And I tend to agree with you that smaller brands that are primarily on one or two channels don't need sort of sophisticated measurement. But what would you recommend a smaller brand to do when they are going from one channel to two channels or to three channels? They're on that cusp, right, where they're starting to expand and scale. What should they set up before they take that leap?
Yeah, it's a good question. I always I always chuckle at this question because the answer sucks. And I joke I only get 3 of these a day, so I'm going to use this is probably my third one. It's late in the afternoon for me, but it depends, right? It's my answer. I only get 3. It depends a
Yep.
day, so this is my third one. But in general, that's not helpful. So in general, what I recommend instead is if you're at the stage where you're very confident in your baseline performance, your baseline measurement, either you've done a model or you just looking at business metrics, we spend this much and we generate this revenue, and every month or every year we're growing at this steady pace, and I understand that base and I'm comfortable with that base, then at the next tier up from that generally is doing a very simple experiment. I think you can
Mm,
do, it wouldn't be a true scientific incrementality experiment, but introducing a new channel into a mix, whether it's with the same overall budget mix or with an incremental increase in that budget. So I'll give you an example. Let's say you're spending, I don't know, $50,000 a month in Google and $50,000 a month in Meta for $100,000 a month in total. And you're like, okay, this is great. We're kind of capped out from our perspective. Our baseline is stable. We want to expand into TikTok for whatever reason. We're going to do $50,000 into TikTok as well. Probably in month one, maybe month two, you won't see revenue rise with that 50% increase in total ad spend investment. You went from 100 to 150, but maybe by month two, month three, and downstream, do you see that rise? And it's a very simple methodology called a
yep.
stair step test. I'm just stepping up from one to the next, right? I'm introducing a new element, equal weight across everything else, and just seeing what the downstream impact is. Not super scientific, not particularly verifiable, right? But it is a simple way to get to some kind of answer. Now, a superior method of that would be to run that third channel in a true test and control type of experiment, right? And the most common form that I've seen that works well when introducing a new paid channel in particular is a geographical experiment. So if you identify two markets as being very similar, they have similar seasonality, they have similar historical levels of revenue, et cetera, et cetera. If you run TikTok in this example in just one of those markets and then look at its total revenue, does the total revenue jump up in that market compared to its sister market, its matched market, then you can feel with some certainty that you are incrementally driving an impact, right? If you on the flip side, if you ran that experiment, quote unquote, you put TikTok into the one market and it didn't do anything, and the other market also didn't do anything, well, TikTok maybe wasn't executed right, maybe you didn't have the right creative, maybe you didn't spend the right, or maybe the channel just doesn't work for your audience. I don't know. So that's like a kind of baby's first incrementality test. And then there's increasingly levels of sophistication downstream. If you're a really big organization, though, or a really tried and true mature organization, even if you're not big in revenue, but you're mature, that's where I think media mix modeling actually becomes more and more compelling because there's going to be a lot, and marketing mix modeling at large beyond just paid media. What are other factors that contribute to my brand? Is it my seasonality? Is it my pricing? Is it my competition? And I think that's viable even for smaller businesses like, in the 10 to $30 million range if they're established and mature. And the reason why that's important, in my experience at least, is the more mature the business is, the easier it is for a model to pick up on the trends and the seasonality and those kind of non-paid elements as being contributing factors to revenue growth.
Well said. I really like the idea of starting with incrementality testing, especially when you're at that stage where you have a very clear baseline. And I like the phrase that you use, the stair step testing. I think that's wonderful. And I have to say, it's pretty scientific. I don't think you should sell that as not scientific. That's a pretty good way to construct a test. Not everything has to be a geo test or a perfectly randomly controlled trial, right? Um, Awesome. Now, one of the things that I have noticed with brands, what ends up happening is they secure some funding and they got, 5 million or 10 million in the bank, and they immediately go and try a whole bunch of things, right? There's some conventional wisdom, try a whole bunch of things and see what works. And what you've just described is the complete opposite, where you're saying start with one channel at a given time, give it enough time for it to mature, right? 2 or 3 months to see whether that has an effect before you go to the next thing. Can you talk about why you suggested that versus running 5 channels at the same time when you're going from that 100K to, like,
Yeah,
why not just go
absolutely.
straight to
So
500K and
I
five
think,
channels?
yeah, so the reason why I like to do one thing at a time is it's sort of the poor man's version of science, right? The fewer variables that I'm introducing into a mixture, the easier it is for me to understand what the impact of that was. I often compare marketing and business growth to cooking, and a
Mm.
media mix is like a recipe. And if I'm taking a fistful of 10 different spices and dumping it in my pot of stew, and it tastes bad, I don't really know what caused it to taste bad. It's just maybe it's the combination, maybe it's the quantity, maybe it's one
Uh,
particular spice. I don't know. But if I have my stew and I add one spice at a time and I test it and I taste it and I'm like, oh, okay, I need a little bit more of this, I need a little bit more of that, I can tweak it, right? And so that's the same way that I would approach if I was building a business, how to kind of get into that. And especially if you've opened up funding. I think the other thing that a lot of brands don't like to hear, and I, do a lot of tough love over at Power Digital, is it should not be hard to grow. If
mm.
you are struggling to grow and you're trying tons of things and you're dabbling in tons of areas and we tested this and we tested that and we tried this and we tried that, it's probably not your marketing. It's probably
Yeah.
something with your product or your product market fit or your pricing model or your offer. right? All you could say that all those things connect to marketing, sure, semantics, whatever, but there's
Yeah.
something more systemic or fundamental to the business that's maybe a limiting factor. I'll give you an example. A lot of brands come to us and they say, "Hey, we've kind of plateaued at our revenue around 15, $20 million a year." It's a very common kind of
Mm,
stagnation point, that sort of mid eight-figure range, 15, $20 million a year. And we don't know how to grow. We've been doing this, we've been doing that, we've been testing these things, we've been dabbling, we have investment, we have opportunity, but we don't know how to grow. And the first thing I do is I load their data into our tool, Nova, and I look at how many customers, not percentage of revenue, but how many of their customers actually buy on a recurring basis. And
mm,
almost without fail, those brands have a repeat customer issue. They have an LTV issue. Their
right.
overwhelming majority of their customers are one and dones. Maybe it's 80%, maybe even 90% in a year or even a longer stretch of time. And what that means is that they're constantly having to fill that funnel. They're constantly having to acquire new customers, and so they're just barely keeping the fire alive. As opposed to what they really need to do is sit down and think through, what is my product strategy? Why would a customer buy from me multiple times? Is it multiple? Is it quantity of selection? Is it more of a consumable good? Is it some kind of subscription? What's the business model reason that a customer would buy from me every quarter? And when they
Yeah.
don't have that and they're stuck at that plateau, no amount of ad spend is going to save them, right? They may be able to grow 2x, but then again, all those customers will bleed out and they won't ever hit that next kind of echelon or that next tier. And so this is why it's so important to understand the entirety of your business. And dabbling a lot of times is a symptom. And when I say dabbling, I mean I'm going to do a
Mm,
$10,000 test over here and a $10,000 test over here and a $10,000 test over here. That type of dabbling is usually a symptom of a lack of focus and a lack of understanding of the fundamentals of the business. If you have a clear focus and a clear fundamental understanding of the business and a product that customers want to buy, you almost don't have to do anything. It just kind of goes on its own. And in fact, most of the brands that I've worked with that have gone from 0 to 100 million or 0 to 250 million, not to discount their efforts, they kind of don't even know why. They're like, I caught lightning in a bottle and it's great. And that tells me that that's a business that's worth continuing to invest in. If you've been
right.
doing this for 10, 20, 15 years and you cannot get past a certain threshold, you need to take a hard look at in the mirror at your product, at your business model. Something's wrong.
Yeah. That's very well said. And, it goes back to that original point that you were making about your own analysis of the power digital business, right? There was something that was missing in terms of that repeat rate, right? And there were a few customers that were leaving. And you looked at that analytically and said, okay, this is what's broken. We're going to go fix that by improving our strategy team and our strategy function. And lo and behold, like now it changes the equation. This is the exact same sort of point, even in a services or a SaaS environment. Okay, so one of the things that I truly believe about this whole optimization, whether it's media mix modeling or testing or what have you, is the most important element of that optimization is the creative. No amount of measurement is going to unlock growth unless you have good ideas. So, how do you think about when brands have hit that plateau? Let's say they go fix some of the product issues or what have you. How do you think about creative messaging, positioning? Um, what advice do you give brands, and like how should they even think about that for their growth?
Yeah, it's a great question. And I think creative is often in the performance marketer era that we've been in the last 15, 20 years. I think that creative has kind of unfortunately taken a back seat until more recently because so much of it was, how can we maximize the programmatic methodology that we're buying? How can we maximize the algorithmic method that we're optimizing? What's the data tell me? There's a lot of spreadsheet work, right? If you look at
Yep.
marketing prior to the digital era, most of it was creative centric. And that's because that was the main vehicle that you had to target people and to get people's attention and to actually drive incremental change. And sort of that growth or evolution towards more of a data driven marketer, I think a lot of people grew up like myself as an analyst type of person rather than as a creative strategic thinker. And so, in a lot of cases now, I think we're seeing the pendulum kind of swing back. Some of that's driven to some of the limitations that we're seeing in various ad platforms, some of it in the targeting methodologies that we have, where creative is becoming more and more kind of front and center. But I've always felt that creative is at least half, if not more than half, of the impact. And Nielsen, they release a study every couple of years, and they just released one at the beginning of 2024 that estimates the incremental effect of creative. If you have two campaigns that are otherwise identical, what is the effect of creative on that in terms of incremental revenue, brand affinity, brand recognition? And from a revenue standpoint, they think it's 56%. So more than
Oh, wow.
half is from creative. And the
Yeah.
way I explain this to people, brands and teams all the time is imagine you had the perfect media campaign. Imagine you're targeting everybody exactly how you want, you're spending the right amounts, you're optimizing perfectly, but all of your ads were just a white square. Do you think it would do anything? Well, of course not. Duh. It would do one thing, right? And so, on a spectrum between a white square and the perfect creative, every creative falls somewhere in that spectrum, right? And so, you can
Yep.
always put an effort towards how do we optimize the creative. And I think it really comes down to a couple of things. One is creative that's built to resonate with the right type of customer versus creative that's built to elicit a specific short-term action. And a lot of the time those things are not the same thing. Some people may define that as brand creative versus performance creative, or um, top of funnel awareness creative versus bottom of funnel conversion creative. That's fine. That's a fine kind of way to think about it. But I think about it more in terms of what is the value prop of the
Mm.
actual product itself, and how can I communicate that as clearly as possible to my intended audience. And so when you're looking at that, it means that sometimes you have to sacrifice the short term direct response nature of creative to drive a higher value customer. And so one of the things that, and we actually just released a press release on this just today. Today's the 11th, is the day that we're recording this. One of the things that
Yeah.
Power Digital is focused on is tying the customer lifetime value with the first creative exposure that we have record for them. So we've developed a kind of a clean room methodology where we can track Ben was exposed to this particular ad in Meta, and then
Mm.
purchased, and then 6 months later purchased again, and then 6 months after that purchased again. Those future purchases that accumulate a lifetime value tie back to that initial ad creative exposure. And we're over 350,000 ads in that system that we have in partnership with our brands that we manage. And there's some pretty stark patterns in there where the most performant ads from a short term, they got a click, they got a same session conversion, are often not the ones that drive the best lifetime value. Not all the time, but
Mm.
often not. And a lot of it has to do with, I think the customer is sort of impulse convinced. There's like a hard sell in the creative versus this creative is actually deeply sort of resonating with with their own kind
Yeah.
of lifestyle or their own sort of self-worth in some way. And so I think having a mixture of creative that elicits action but also resonates with the type of ideal customer that is going to generate a long lifetime value for the brand is really important, and bringing that level of data into a strategic ideation session makes that so much more valuable for our producers, for our creative directors, and for our brands because it kind of tells the whole story.
Yeah, that's a. I have to go look at that press release. It sounds awesome and very much in line with all the other academic research that has come out over the last few decades. Right? We always forget that this stuff is being studied all the time, and so one of the things that there's this misconception in marketing that, oh, don't worry about that campaign. That's focused on long term, and we're going to see results from that in 3 quarters or 4 quarters or what have you. And I tend to say that, hey, if it's not moving the needle in the shorter term, it's probably not going to move the needle in the longer term. What do you think about that way of looking at some of the brand marketing or longer term sort of marketing aspects of things? I'm just curious what your take is.
Yeah, I think that it's complicated, right? I think a lot of it has to do with the nature of the product itself and its consideration
Mhm.
cycle. I'll give you an example. If you're selling a car, It's an expensive product. It has a certain life event required typically. People need to buy a car when at least in the US, when they need to buy a car. Unless you're
Yep.
particularly wealthy and you just are a car collector and you like to buy cool cars, which, more power to you, I guess. But most people who buy a car, they need to buy a car. Their car
Yeah.
is not servicing them appropriately anymore, or literally doesn't work anymore, or maybe their child became of age and they need a car, or whatever. Some sort of life event took place. We can't control when those life events occur, right? As marketers, if I'm an auto manufacturer or marketer, I can't affect that Ben's car is going to break down 6 months or 6 years in the future, and then I'm going to buy a new one, right? So I would argue in those kinds of products, high value products, high or long consideration cycle products, brand type creative, top of funnel type creative, very high affinity sort of awareness campaigns, whatever you want to call them. I don't think that we will see short term business outcome movement. You won't see necessarily a revenue shift with the launch of that in 2 weeks or 30 days, probably. But you
Yeah.
might see leading indicators in the short term. And so, what you could do potentially is like a brand lift study or a favorability survey. You could track against, oh, am I seeing a spike of brand search demand in my area that I'm running this campaign? Am I seeing a spike in overall organic traffic to my website? Am I getting a lot of new phone calls to my call center, et cetera, et cetera? So I think that I agree generally philosophically with what you said, but you have to make sure that you're looking at the right KPI in those early days as a leading indicator and not necessarily tie everything to revenue. If, and this is important, if the consideration cycle for the product is more than a couple of weeks, right? Now, if it's a hoodie or a new video game or something, sure. I think that any kind of creative, you should see within a month an incremental effect. Now, what's
Yeah.
interesting is I had a client who we ran a top of funnel brand campaign on YouTube actually for them, and just for a short sprint for about a 2 month window, and only in certain areas. It was a match market test, a geo test, and the initial results were okay. The incrementality of it was okay from a revenue standpoint. It wasn't profitable, but it was something. We saw some kind of early indication and paused it. And at the time, I felt rightly so, should have paused it. But
Mm.
for an additional 6 months after that campaign had concluded, we would go back and look at the incremental revenue in that market that that campaign was running in, and it continued to grow and compound. And so, all the way over to 6 months, we saw
Wow.
that that turned from a okay, probably should have paused it readout to a actually, this was a great ROI over this time. And so, there is a compounding nature. And that was for a relatively short consideration cycle personal health care good that doesn't require 6 months to think about. It was just, it had planted the seed in enough people's mind in that market to where when that life event occurred and they did need that personal hygiene product, they were able to buy
Right.
it. And over a long period of time, and it compounded. So I guess all that's to say is it's nuanced, dependent upon the products, dependent upon the type of media, dependent upon the type of metrics you have access to. But I would say in general, you should see some kind of early lift, something, some sort of reaction in the market, even if it's not revenue.
Well said. Well, on that note, I think it's timely to kind of bring it to a close. This has been a wonderful conversation. Thank you. I know you give away a lot of your time. I know you have an open office hours link on your LinkedIn. So if anybody's listening and they want to find out more about Power Digital and how Power Digital helps brands, or how Ben thinks about creative measurement and everything in between, reach out to him. And Ben, thanks again for joining us, and hopefully we'll do this again in a few months.
Yeah, for sure. Thanks so much for having me. It was a great combo.
Well, there you go, folks. That was Ben, the Chief Strategy Officer at Power Digital. We'll have many more fun and insightful conversations, so tune in again next week. See you then.